The air conditioning hit my bare scalp first. That was the sensation that told me I was really doing this. I walked through the double doors of Stonebridge Manor, letting the heavy oak close behind me. The scent of white gardenias and expensive vanilla candles hung thick in the air, instantly suffocating. Then came the sound, a collective intake of breath from 300 guests, followed by the rapid, mechanical clicking of promotional cameras. I wore a navy blue dress. I did not wear a wig. I did not look down. 15 months have passed since that Saturday. People still ask me why I walked into my sister's wedding reception, looking like a psychiatric patient who had escaped a locked ward. They think I went there to ruin her perfect day. They do not understand that my hair was the smallest thing my parents tried to steal from me that weekend. My name is Mara Whitaker. At 39, I had built a quiet, bulletproof life as a corporate compliance investigator in Washington. My job was finding the lies hidden in spreadsheets and boardrooms. I was not supposed to be the public spectacle, but standing in that ballroom, feeling the camera flashes hot against my face, I knew my quiet life was over. My mother, Constance, was the first to move. She wore a champagne gown that probably cost more than my car. The practiced, compassionate smile she used for her family values seminars slid perfectly into place. She approached me with her hands outstretched, speaking in that soft, devastating tone she reserved for an audience. "Oh, Mara," she whispered loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "You are clearly unwell. We need to get you some help." My father stepped up right behind her. Harold Whitaker did not bother with the gentle act. His jaw was locked tight. He gestured to the venue's security guards stationed near the ice sculpture. "Escort my daughter out," he ordered. "She is having an episode." 2 men in dark suits stepped forward, and I did not step back. I kept my hands visible and open by my sides. I looked directly at the head of security, a man whose name tag read David. "David," I said, keeping my voice entirely conversational. "Before you put a hand on me, you might want to check your email. My attorney sent a notice to this venue an hour ago. If you touch someone who filed a criminal assault report against the Whitaker family at 6 o'clock this morning, your employer becomes liable." David froze. He raised a hand to his earpiece, listened for 3 seconds, and took a deliberate step back. Harold's face darkened. The narrative he had spent 12 years building about his unstable, destructive eldest daughter was slipping. He opened his mouth to give another order, but the crowd suddenly parted. Elise appeared. My little sister looked like a magazine cover. Her white lace train dragged softly across the marble floor, and her makeup was flawless, hiding whatever guilt she might have been carrying. She stopped 10 feet away from me. Her expression remained completely unreadable, a perfect blank slate. "You should not have come," Elise said. The words sounded rehearsed, like she was reading from a script floating just above my head. Graham Hale stepped up beside her. The groom. The man whose family company was about to buy a 60% stake in our parents' wedding resort empire. Graham looked at my shaved head, then at Elise, confusion breaking through his polished exterior. "What happened to her?" Graham asked. "I have no idea," Elise lied smoothly, not breaking eye contact with me. That was the moment I could have screamed. I could have pointed at my mother and father and told everyone what they did to me in the early hours of Friday morning. But a public meltdown was exactly what Harold and Constance needed. A meltdown would validate the fake video they were planning to release. So I ignored my family. I turned all my attention to the groom. "Graham," I said, projecting my voice just enough to carry over the whispers. "At noon today, you are scheduled to sign the final merger documents. Are you absolutely certain you want to sign a legal declaration verifying that all vendor debts and client deposits for Whitaker Heritage are fully accounted for?" The silence in the room changed. It stopped being the silence of a family scandal and became the silence of a corporate panic. Graham did not look at me like I was crazy. He looked immediately at my father. That one glance told me everything. Graham already knew something was wrong with the numbers, and my question had just confirmed his worst fear. Before Harold could formulate a lie, a phone rang. It was not a guest's phone. It was the transaction attorney standing near the bar. A second later, Harold's pocket vibrated. Then my mother's assistant tapped her on the shoulder, holding out a glowing screen. The evidence packets had landed. The banks, the lawyers, and the insurance underwriters were all reading the same documents at the exact same time. I watched the color drain from my father's face, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing for him. No fear, no anger, just the cold realization that the structure holding this family together was finally collapsing. To understand how a wedding turned into a crime scene, you have to go back. 36 hours before I walked into that ballroom, I still had my hair, and I still had my illusions that keeping my distance was enough to keep me safe. It was Thursday evening. I was sitting at my kitchen island in Arlington, reviewing a risk assessment report for a client. The rain was hitting the glass balcony door in heavy, rhythmic sheets. I had not spoken to my parents in 12 years. I had not seen my sister since she was 20. I had built a wall of silence between my new life and my old one, and I fully intended to die behind it. Then the doorbell rang. I checked the security camera feed on my phone. The hallway was empty. I walked to the door, slid the deadbolt open, and looked out. A plain manila envelope sat on the welcome mat. There were no stamps, no return address, just my name written in black marker. I picked it up, feeling the distinct outline of a plastic card pressing through the paper. I carried it back to the kitchen counter, grabbed a pair of scissors, and sliced the top open. A piece of hard plastic slid out and clattered against the granite. It was an old corporate identification badge. The edges were worn, and the photo showed a much younger version of me, smiling nervously. Below the picture, bold black letters spelled out my old employee code, MW214. I stopped breathing. I had left that badge in the top drawer of my desk at my parents' house 12 years ago, on the day they forced me out. Nobody should have had it. I reached into the envelope again and pulled out a single sheet of lined notebook paper. The handwriting was messy, rushed, looping sharply at the ends of the letters. I would recognize my sister's writing anywhere. The note contained 3 sentences. They are going to do to me what they did to you. Come before Friday night. Do not trust the messages from my phone. My hands began to shake. The old panic, the one I paid a therapist thousands of dollars to help me bury, flared to life in my chest. What they did to you. Elise knew exactly what that meant, because she had helped them do it. Before I could process the words, my cell phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with a new text message. The sender was listed as Elise. I picked up the phone and read the message twice to make sure my eyes were working. Stay away from my wedding, you pathetic psycho. We have built a separate life without you. I looked at the handwritten note pleading for help. Then I looked at the digital text warning me to stay away. The 2 messages sat side by side, creating a trap I could not figure out how to navigate. I knew I should throw the badge in the trash, block the number, and go back to my quiet life. That would have been the smart thing to do. But I packed a bag instead. I zipped the overnight bag and stared at the dark canvas fabric for a long time. My apartment in Arlington was entirely quiet, save for the heavy April rain lashing against the balcony glass. The water blurred the glowing taillights of the traffic on the highway below, turning the city into a smear of red and gold. I had spent the last 12 years building this quiet, highly controlled life. My career as an internal corporate investigator paid well enough to afford the view, and the distance kept the ghosts of my past firmly locked out. The phone buzzing on the kitchen island shattered the silence. Naomi Pierce's name lit up the screen. My oldest friend and the sharpest civil attorney in the district did not bother with a greeting when I answered. You are making a mistake, Mara, Naomi said, her voice crisp and echoing slightly over the car speakerphone. She was likely driving home from the courthouse. Pinning the phone between my ear and shoulder, I tossed a spare charging cable into the duffel bag. Just yesterday, the 2 of us had sat across a mahogany table from a defiant tech executive and forced him to turn over 3 years of hidden ledgers. I knew how to handle liars, and Naomi knew the law. But family was a completely different category of risk. I am just going to drive down and verify the documents, I told her, carrying the phone back to the kitchen counter. If Elise is actually in trouble, I cannot ignore it. And if this is a trap, I want to know exactly what they are building. They destroyed your career once, Naomi countered, the rhythmic thump of her windshield wipers bleeding through the speaker. You have spent a decade rebuilding your reputation. Do not walk back into a burning house just because the arsonist sent you an invitation. I ended the call a minute later with a promise to check in, but my eyes immediately dropped back to the object resting on the granite counter. After Naomi ended the call, I set the old badge beside Elise's handwritten note. Those two objects should have been enough to make me walk away. Instead, they pulled me back to the week my family first used my name as a weapon. 12 years ago, I was 27 years old. I worked in the internal compliance department for Whitaker Heritage, reviewing expenditure reports for our family's expanding portfolio of wedding resorts. I believed in the business, and I believed in the numbers, until I opened a digital folder that Harold Whitaker had carelessly left unencrypted. The documents detailed a massive cash transfer from the Whitaker Family Foundation. On paper, the transaction was neatly categorized as a philanthropic grant for a community center renovation. The external file even contained glossy photos of construction equipment and progress reports. But the internal administrative ledger, the one I was never supposed to find, tracked the money to a completely different destination. $420,000 had been routed directly into a private commercial resort development managed by one of my father's business associates. I printed the ledgers and brought them to Harold's office. My father had leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers across his chest. He did not yell, and he did not panic. He simply called the transfer a temporary cash flow adjustment, speaking with the calm, chilling authority of a man who believed the rules were written for other people. Constance had stepped into the office a moment later, her expensive floral perfume suffocating the small space. The woman who raised me placed a manicured hand on my shoulder, her voice dripping with artificial sorrow. She explained that exposing this adjustment would ruin hundreds of innocent employees and destroy the family legacy. She asked me to sign the internal validation forms, framing the fraud as an act of familial loyalty. I refused to sign. That refusal was my fatal mistake. I naively believed the truth held more power than the brand. The next morning, they summoned me back into the executive suite. Elise was sitting on the leather sofa, her face red and blotchy from crying. She was only 20 years old at the time. Without making eye contact with me, my sister handed Harold a signed statement. The single sheet of paper claimed she had witnessed me downloading sensitive corporate documents and threatening to extort our parents for money. They did not call the police, because a formal investigation would have opened their books to external auditors. Instead, my parents handed me a typed resignation letter and a draconian non-disclosure agreement. "Sign the papers and leave the state," Harold had said, "or we release this statement and ruin your future forever." I packed a cardboard box, left my badge in the desk drawer, and walked out of the house. Within a week, Constance had quietly seeded a story through their vast social network, claiming her eldest daughter had suffered a severe mental breakdown and needed to be institutionalized. I shook the memory away and focused on the laptop open on my kitchen counter. The blue light cast a pale glow across the room as I typed the name Whitaker Heritage into the search engine. The results were completely flooded with promotional articles, society page features, and financial blog posts about the upcoming weekend. The event was being marketed as the ultimate corporate merger disguised as a luxury wedding. Hale Lodging, a massive hospitality conglomerate, was positioned to acquire a 60% stake in our family empire. Photographs of the groom, Graham Hale, dominated the press releases. He was 36 years old, standing next to Elise in every picture, smiling the confident, relaxed smile of a future industry leader. The financial journalists noted that the final closing signatures were scheduled for noon on Saturday, just hours before the wedding ceremony. I scrolled past the engagement photos and clicked on a dense public financial filing linked to the merger. My eyes scanned the boilerplate text, looking for anything out of place, until a single line in a subsidiary asset list stopped my breath. A holding company scheduled to be absorbed in the transaction had the exact same name as the dummy corporation Harold had used 12 years ago. The fraud had not stopped when I left. It had simply mutated, grown deeper and more complex. Now, my parents were going to use a multi-million-dollar merger to bury their bad debt inside the Hale family accounts forever. Graham Hale was either a willing co-conspirator helping them move the money, or he was walking into a financial slaughterhouse completely blindfolded. I had to know which one. Closing the laptop, I picked up my phone and called Naomi back. We spent 20 minutes establishing a strict safety protocol. I activated an automatic synchronization feature on my phone, linking my audio recording application and camera roll directly to a secure, encrypted folder hosted on Naomi's legal servers. We agreed on mandatory check-in times. If I missed a call, she would immediately contact the local authorities. Most importantly, I promised her I would not sleep in that house. I booked a room at a chain hotel 3 miles down the highway from the estate. The plan was simple. I would drive down, demand the original documents Elise promised in her note, and leave immediately. While I was standing by the door, double-checking my car keys, the phone vibrated violently against my palm. The caller identification showed my sister's number. I pressed the green button and put the device on speakerphone, setting it gently on the hallway table. Mare. Elise spoke my name like a curse. Her voice was entirely flat, stripped of any warmth or natural inflection. "Do not come to this wedding," the bride commanded. I did not respond immediately. I leaned closer to the speaker, listening to the ambient noise beneath her voice. A faint friction crackled through the connection, sounding exactly like expensive wool fabric moving against leather. Then, a low, muffled clearing of a throat echoed in the background. Someone was standing right next to her, monitoring the call. "You made your choice a long time ago," Elise continued, the words marching out in a stiff, rehearsed rhythm. "We do not want you here. The blue room is still locked." The line went completely dead. I stared at the black screen, my pulse suddenly hammering against my ribs. The blue room. That was the old file room on the second floor of the main estate, the room where Harold notoriously kept the physical copies of his most sensitive ledgers. Elise was putting on a performance for whoever was listening to the call, while simultaneously handing me the exact map to the evidence. The invitation was undeniably a trap. But the documents waiting inside the jaws of that trap were real. I grabbed my bag, locked the apartment, and walked out into the storm. The drive took 2.5 hours. The relentless rain followed me all the way down the interstate, turning the winding Virginia back roads into slick, black ribbons reflecting my headlights. I gripped the steering wheel, running through every possible scenario, analyzing the risks with the cold detachment my job required. But beneath the logic, a dormant anger was finally waking up. I pulled up to the towering iron gates of the Whitaker estate just past 9 o'clock on Thursday night. The massive stone house loomed at the end of the long, circular driveway. Every window on the ground floor was blazing with warm yellow light, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. The architecture looked exactly as it had a decade ago, standing as a perfect, impenetrable fortress of curated lies. Parking near the decorative fountain, I grabbed my duffel bag and walked up the wide stone steps. The heavy brass knocker felt freezing against my palm. I lifted the metal ring and let it drop twice, the sound echoing loudly against the thick oak door. A lock clicked, and the door swung inward. Constance stood in the grand foyer. The matriarch wore a soft cashmere sweater and perfectly pressed slacks, her silver hair styled flawlessly despite the late hour. She looked down at my wet boots, then at the overnight bag hanging from my shoulder. That practiced, compassionate smile blossomed on her face, but her eyes remained entirely cold. "Mara," my mother said softly, her tone carrying the sweet, poisonous concern I remembered so well. "Your sister changed her mind. She is not here right now." Before I could ask where Elise was, a shadow shifted in the hallway behind the staircase. Harold stepped into the light. My father wore a dark suit jacket, his expression completely unreadable. He walked past Constance, reached out into the damp night air, and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door. He pulled it shut behind me. The deadbolt clicked into place with a sharp, heavy thud that reverberated through the silent foyer. "But since you drove all this way," Constance continued, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly gentle whisper, "we should finally talk about what really happened 12 years ago." The deadbolt clicked into place with a sharp, heavy thud that reverberated through the silent foyer. I did not step back, and I did not ask my father to unlock the door. Panic was a currency I stopped spending in this house a long time ago. Constance led the way into the formal dining room, moving with the graceful, unhurried glide of a woman who completely controlled her environment. The space smelled strongly of roasted garlic and fresh rosemary. She had prepared lemon herb chicken, which was my favorite meal when I was 15 years old. The perfectly set mahogany table, complete with crystal water glasses and heavy silver cutlery, formed a grotesque pantomime of a welcoming home. Harold took his seat at the head of the table. The patriarch poured himself a glass of red wine, swirling the dark liquid while he spoke of the upcoming merger in broad, sweeping terms. He claimed the Hale family transaction represented a new era of stability, casually suggesting that ancient family disagreements should not be allowed to ruin the future. I sat near the center of the long table, keeping my overnight bag resting against my leg on the hardwood floor. When I asked where the bride was, the woman who raised me offered a soft, dismissive wave of her hand. Elise was allegedly attending a private rehearsal dinner across town with the bridal party. The first tactical maneuver happened halfway through the meal. I had placed my cell phone on the linen tablecloth near my water glass, keeping the screen visible in case Naomi called. Constance stood up to clear the appetizer plates, her elbow lightly brushing the edge of my device. She apologized smoothly, picking the phone up and placing it on the wooden sideboard directly behind my chair. The movement disguised a deliberate relocation, putting my only line of communication just out of my immediate reach. I ignored the bait and reached into my jacket pocket instead. Placing the old corporate identification card flat on the linen tablecloth, I slid it toward the head of the table. MW214. Harold stopped swirling his wine. The crystal stemware hit the heavy wooden coaster with a sharp crack. His jaw muscles feathered. "Why do you still keep the trash of a thief?" the old man asked, his voice dropping an octave. Abandoning the welcoming father routine entirely, I told him I wanted to see the blue room. That specific request caused Constance to freeze halfway to the kitchen doors. Harold quickly recovered, stating smoothly that the old file room was currently undergoing floor renovations and the contractors had misplaced the only key. The lie was beautifully delivered, but the house itself betrayed him. 10 minutes later, I excused myself to use the powder room in the east wing. Walking past the heavy oak door of the blue room, I looked down at the hallway baseboards. A thin, gray layer of undisturbed dust coated the floor, except for a perfect, clean crescent sweeping outward from the doorframe. Someone had opened that room very recently. The familiar, warning throb of a migraine started at the base of my skull, right as I returned to the dining room. The stress of the long drive through the rainstorm was catching up to my nervous system. I retrieved a small orange prescription bottle from my duffel bag and set a single white pill on the table. Constance materialized instantly, carrying a fresh glass of ice water. She set it down next to the medication, her face a mask of sweet, suffocating concern before turning her back to adjust the thermostat on the wall. I stepped into the adjacent kitchen just long enough to grab a paper napkin. When I returned, the water glass sat exactly where she had left it. However, the heavy condensation pattern on the side of the crystal had been smeared away, and a faint, oily smudge lingered on the rim. I fully intended to leave the pill, grab my bag, and walk out the front door. But a sudden vibration buzzed against the wooden sideboard behind me. I turned and tapped the screen of my relocated phone. A new text message from Elise glowed brightly in the dim room. The original statement is in the blue room. Tonight only. Hope is a dangerous liability, especially when dealing with people who view affection as leverage. I made the conscious, fatal decision to stay one more hour. Reaching out, I picked up the glass and swallowed my medication, completely unaware that I was drinking the mechanism of my own destruction. 10 minutes later, the air inside the dining room grew incredibly thick. My tongue felt like dry cotton, swelling against the roof of my mouth. I tried to stand up, and the heavy wooden chair scraped loudly across the floorboards. My knees immediately turned to water, refusing to lock. Harold stood up slowly, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to a state of predatory calm. "You are having an episode again, Mara," my father said, speaking clearly toward the empty corners of the room as if addressing an invisible audience. I reached blindly into my jacket pocket, my fingers finding the cold aluminum edge of my phone. My heart hammered a erratic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. I pressed the physical side button 3 times in rapid succession, a muscle memory shortcut that activated an audio recording application. The phone vibrated once, confirming the command, just as the Persian rug rushed up to meet my face. Consciousness shattered into disconnected fragments. The harsh, mechanical buzz of a motorized clipper echoed against tiled walls. A blast of freezing air hit my scalp, followed instantly by the sensation of cold steel dragging violently across my skin. A sharp sting flared behind my right ear, where metal teeth caught the flesh. "Hold her head still," Constance whispered, her breath smelling faintly of peppermint and expensive wine. "We just need enough footage to prove she did it herself," Harold replied from somewhere above the buzzing noise. The heavy clippers paused for a fraction of a second. "Make her look like herself again," the old man commanded. My mother let out a small, practical sigh. "She only needs to sleep long enough for us to finish the angles." Darkness pulled me under again, thick and heavy. Morning light stabbed through the gaps in the heavy velvet curtains when I finally opened my eyes. The ceiling medallion of the guest bedroom spun lazily in circles. My head felt terrifyingly light, while a dull, burning ache radiated across my bare scalp. The ambient temperature of the room felt like winter against my unprotected skin. Harold stood directly over the bed. He was holding his smartphone horizontally, the small red recording indicator blinking steadily. "Put the clippers down, Mara," my father commanded, lacing his voice with a sickeningly authentic tone of panic. "Please, just put them down." I forced my heavy chin downward. My right hand was resting on the blanket, loosely gripping a heavy, professional-grade hair clipper. Constance hovered near the bedroom door, her breathing intentionally loud and erratic. They were filming the aftermath, carefully building a fake, visual narrative of a mental breakdown to explain my appearance at the wedding. Screaming would only give them the hysterical audio track they needed. Throwing the machine against the wall would provide footage of a violent outburst. Instead, I took a slow, shallow breath. I carefully lifted the clippers and set them gently on the wooden bedside table. I looked directly into the camera lens, maintaining a completely flat expression, and spoke clearly over the ringing in my ears. "It is Friday morning. I have been drugged without my consent, and I need an ambulance." Harold cursed sharply and lowered his phone. The calm, lucid sentence had instantly ruined the script. The matriarch grabbed her husband's arm, pulling him into the hallway to regroup. The door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the freezing room. Adrenaline finally pierced through the heavy fog of the sedatives. I forced my useless, trembling limbs into motion, dragging myself out of the bed and over to my duffel bag on the floor. My phone was gone, entirely stripped from my jacket pocket. I dug my fingernails into the canvas lining of the bag and retrieved my spare electronic car key. Checking my wrist, I found my cellular smartwatch still strapped tightly in place. The screen lit up, but the signal indicator displayed a flat line. The thick stone construction of the historic estate acted as a perfect dead zone, blocking all cellular transmission. I needed to get outside. Avoiding the grand staircase, I crept down the narrow wooden service steps at the back of the house. The kitchen was empty, smelling of bleach and cold coffee. I pushed through the heavy service door and stepped out into the damp, gray morning air. The wet gravel crunched loudly beneath my boots as I walked rapidly toward the main iron gates at the edge of the property. Every step sent a spike of nausea rolling through my stomach, but the cold wind hitting my raw scalp kept me moving. The moment I cleared the dense tree line bordering the estate, the watch vibrated violently against my wrist. Cellular connection established. A small, green progress bar appeared on the tiny glass screen. The audio file recorded during my collapse last night was actively pushing through the network, syncing directly to the secure cloud folder Naomi monitored from her office. Flashing blue and red lights cut through the morning fog just beyond the stone pillars. A local police cruiser idled on the shoulder of the highway. Naomi had missed my required morning check-in, recognized the sudden upload of data, and immediately called dispatch for a wellness check, using the location coordinates attached to the file. 2 uniformed officers stepped out of the cruiser, resting their hands cautiously on their duty belts as they watched a barefoot woman with a bleeding, shaved head walk toward them. I did not look back at the sprawling house, and I did not run toward the event pavilion where the wedding setup was already beginning. I walked straight to the patrol car and asked the closest officer for a medical transport. 2 hours later, I sat on the crinkling paper of an examination table at a local urgent care clinic. The small room smelled overwhelmingly of rubbing alcohol and sterile bandages. A nurse had just finished swabbing my scalp and drawing 3 vials of blood for a comprehensive toxicology screen. Naomi stood by the closed door, leaning against the pale blue wall. She wore a sharp gray suit, looking completely out of place in the fluorescent medical lighting. Her tablet glowed in her hands. While the local police waited outside in the hallway to take my official assault statement, Naomi had accessed the synchronized folder. A distorted, staticky audio file played through the small speakers of her device, the sound of a motorized clipper ground against the microphone, followed by Harold's distinct, arrogant voice. "If she shows up tomorrow, we release the old file and this one together. Everyone will believe she relapsed." Naomi paused the playback, tapping her manicured fingernail against the edge of the tablet. She looked up from the screen, her brow furrowed in deep professional concentration. "I have the preservation orders ready for the security cameras at the estate, and the lab is rushing your blood work," the attorney said, keeping her voice low. "But you need to tell me exactly what Harold meant. What is the old file?" I reached down and tightened the thin, scratchy hospital blanket around my shivering shoulders, staring at the blank white wall opposite the examination table. "The video they used to erase me 12 years ago," I answered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I thought it never existed. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the urgent care examination room cast a sickly, pale hue over everything. The thin paper covering the examination table crinkled loudly every time I shifted my weight, and the sound echoed off the sterile white walls. 2 local police officers stood near the closed door, their pens scratching against small spiral notebooks. They had just finished taking my official statement regarding the events of the previous night. A nurse stepped forward and handed the taller officer a sealed plastic evidence bag. Inside the clear plastic sat the orange prescription bottle I had carried into my parents' dining room, along with the clothes I had been wearing. The officer nodded, stating that a detective would be assigned to the case, but cautioned that toxicology results and warrant approvals required time. They could not simply drive to the Whitaker estate and place my parents in handcuffs based solely on an initial report. I accepted that reality. Panic and outrage were useless currencies in the legal system, and I needed cold, procedural facts to survive the weekend. Naomi Pierce stood silently near the sink until the officers exited the room. The moment the door clicked shut, my oldest friend opened her leather briefcase. She did not offer me a sympathetic hug or a speech about family betrayal. Instead, she retrieved a crisp, printed document and laid it flat on the metal tray table beside me. "Friendship cannot protect your communications in a court of law, Mara," Naomi said, her voice dropping into its sharpest professional cadence. "This is a limited representation agreement. It covers the assault report and the preservation of evidence. Once you sign it, attorney-client privilege attaches to everything we discuss." I borrowed her pen and signed my name on the bottom line without hesitation. Using Naomi's spare tablet, I logged into my bank account and initiated a wire transfer for $7,500 from my emergency savings. The retainer fee was a massive financial hit, completely wiping out my safety net, but paying for her services established a crucial boundary. I was not asking for a favor. I was hiring a weapon. Naomi verified the transfer on her screen, closed her briefcase, and pulled up the synchronized folder containing the files my smartwatch had pushed to her server. "We need to review the footage before the medication completely leaves your system," the attorney instructed, handing me the tablet. "Do not attempt to edit, copy, or manipulate these files in any way. Just watch." My fingers hovered over the glass screen for a second before pressing play. The video Harold had recorded of me in the guest bedroom began to roll. My father's voice sounded perfectly modulated, laced with a sickeningly authentic tone of panic, as he ordered me to put the clippers down. Seeing myself on the screen, shivering and bald, sent a wave of cold nausea through my stomach. But the emotion vanished the second I looked at the timestamps. "He staged the dialogue," I pointed out, tracking the digital counter in the corner of the screen. "He waited until I opened my eyes, started recording, and immediately delivered his line to establish the narrative. He was building a defense before I could even sit up." Naomi nodded, swiping the screen to open the audio file I had managed to capture under the dining room table. The recording was terrible, muffled by the thick Persian rug and distorted by the heavy fabric of my jacket pocket. However, 2 distinct phrases cut through the static. The first was my mother ordering Harold to make me look like myself again, a direct reference to the fake mental breakdown story they had fabricated 12 years ago. The second phrase belonged to my father, speaking just before the clippers started buzzing. He had clearly stated that if I showed up the next day, they would release the old file and the new one together, ensuring everyone believed I had relapsed. "What exactly is closing today?" Naomi asked, leaning against the examination table. "Your father mentioned a closing, not just a wedding. People do not drug their children to protect a catering schedule." I explained the broader architecture of the weekend. Whitaker Heritage was not simply hosting a marriage ceremony. The event was the public celebration of a massive corporate acquisition. Hale Lodging, a formidable hospitality conglomerate, was purchasing a 60% ownership stake in our family empire. Elise was slated to step into the role of president for the newly merged entity. Harold and Constance were scheduled to receive an exorbitant buyout package, along with lucrative consulting contracts following the transition. "The official investment documents are scheduled to be signed at noon on Saturday," I told her, piecing the timeline together. "That happens 4 hours before the bride walks down the aisle. If Elise and Harold sign those declarations, they are legally verifying that all Whitaker Heritage ledgers, vendor debts, and client deposits are completely accurate." Naomi crossed her arms, her dark eyes narrowing. "And you believe the numbers are fraudulent?" 12 years ago, Harold routed $420,000 from a philanthropic foundation into a private development project, I stated flatly. He hid the theft by categorizing it as a community renovation grant. If he was moving that kind of money back then, he has certainly built a larger mechanism to hide his failing resorts now. If Graham Hale signs that merger agreement, he absorbs all of my father's hidden debt. We did not possess the forensic accounting logs required to halt a multi-million-dollar acquisition, but Naomi knew how to deploy a calculated disruption. Using her legal letterhead, she drafted a highly targeted preservation notice. She did not send the document to the press or the local police. She emailed it directly to the lead transaction attorney representing Hale Lodging. The notice simply advised the buyers that a criminal assault report had been filed against the primary officers of Whitaker Heritage, and formally requested that all digital records associated with the target company be preserved pending a formal investigation. An hour later, I was sitting in the passenger seat of Naomi's sedan, holding a cheap, prepaid cellular phone she had purchased for me at a pharmacy. The temporary device vibrated against my palm. The caller identification displayed a number with a New York area code. I answered the call, keeping the phone off speaker to ensure privacy. "This is Graham Hale," a deep, perfectly controlled voice announced. The groom did not sound angry, just chillingly efficient. "My transaction counsel just received a very interesting email from your attorney. What exactly do you want, Mara?" "I want you to delay the noon signing," I replied, matching his clinical tone. Graham let out a short, dismissive breath. "Your family warned me about this. They said you have a history of making volatile demands when you need money. I am not halting a 9-figure acquisition because you decided to create a scene the day before the wedding." I ignored the insult. "Did your due diligence team review the subsidiary asset list? Specifically, the holding company structured under the Coastal Property Division?" Silence stretched over the cellular connection. When Graham finally spoke again, the dismissive edge was gone. "My accounting team flagged an exception item in the data room early this morning," Graham admitted cautiously. "A vendor reconciliation document looked irregular, and they kicked it up to me for review. But an exception item is not proof of fraud. It just means we need management clarification." He was testing me, trying to figure out how a woman who had been exiled for 12 years knew about the internal architecture of the deal. I realized then that Graham did not have access to the deep forensic logs of Whitaker Heritage. He was only looking at the polished documents my father had chosen to upload into the secure data room. "Do not sign the final declarations tomorrow," I warned him. "If you append your name to those numbers, the debt becomes yours." Graham refused to make a promise. He ended the call abruptly, leaving me staring at the plastic dashboard of Naomi's car. A heavy knot of suspicion began to form in my chest. I opened the internet browser on the prepaid phone and ran a targeted search for Graham Hale's recent corporate filings. A Business Journal article from 3 weeks ago noted that Graham had entered into an exclusive, highly restrictive non-disclosure agreement directly with Harold Whitaker, bypassing the standard corporate channels. While I was reading the article, a text message from Elise arrived on the new device. I had texted her my temporary number from the clinic. "Graham knows everything," my sister wrote. "He will not help you. Do not talk to him." The message created a new, dangerous variable. If Graham had discovered the financial rot weeks ago and signed a separate agreement with my father, the groom might not be a victim at all. He could be actively forcing Elise into the marriage, using the debt as leverage to acquire the properties at a massive discount. "We need to look at the old records," I told Naomi, watching the Virginia landscape blur past the car window. "I need to know exactly how they hid the money when they forced me out." By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we were sitting in Naomi's private office in Alexandria. The space smelled of expensive leather and old paper. I sat at a heavy mahogany desk, logging into a secure cloud server that held my personal legal archives. When I was fired, I had legally retained copies of my own employment contracts, tax documents, and a few printed email chains demonstrating my scope of work. I pulled up a scanned PDF of a vendor communication from 12 years ago. The email detailed the transfer of the community grant funds. I cross-referenced the name of the dummy corporation from the old email with the subsidiary asset list currently posted in the public merger filings. They matched perfectly. The same corporate shell Harold used to steal from a charity was now being packaged and sold to Hale Lodging. But a second detail on the old printout caught my attention, freezing the blood in my veins. The bottom corner of the scanned document displayed a system-generated timestamp, indicating when the file had been officially approved in the internal accounting portal. The approval code listed was MW214. "Naomi," I said, pointing at the screen. "Look at the date on this approval stamp." The attorney leaned over my shoulder, tracking the numbers. October 14th. 12 years ago. "My parents forced me to sign my resignation letter on October 12th, I explained. The reality of the manipulation finally snapping into sharp focus. They confiscated my badge and revoked my building access immediately. I was living in a motel 2 states away on the 14th. Someone inside Whitaker Heritage had kept my legacy account active after my termination. They had used my digital identity to approve the fraudulent transfers, effectively building a permanent trail of evidence that framed me for the theft. If an auditor ever dug into the foundation files, they would find my digital signature authorizing the movement of the stolen money. The fake video of my mental breakdown was only one half of their insurance policy. The legacy account was the other. "I cannot fight this from a desk in Alexandria," I announced, standing up from the leather chair. "I am going to the Stonebridge Resort tonight." Naomi immediately stepped in front of the door. "Absolutely not. You are a victim of a violent assault. Walking back into their territory is incredibly reckless. And it gives their defense attorney a chance to argue that you are not actually afraid of your attackers." "I am not afraid of them," I countered, keeping my voice steady. "I am angry. And Elise promised to give me the original statement she signed 12 years ago. If I have that statement, I can prove they coordinated the fabrication. I am going as an invited guest to a public venue, not sneaking into their private home." We spent another 30 minutes arguing before reaching a strict compromise. Naomi would drive down to Charlottesville and book a room at a hotel located less than a mile from the Stonebridge gates. She would maintain a continuous location track on my phone, and the automatic synchronization protocol would remain active. If I failed to respond to a message within 10 minutes, she would send the local police directly into the reception hall. Before leaving the office, Naomi opened a small closet and pulled out a silk scarf, offering it to me with a look of genuine sympathy. "You can cover your head," she suggested gently. "You do not have to give them the satisfaction of staring at you." I looked at the patterned fabric, then reached up and ran my hand over the rough, uneven stubble covering my scalp. The scratches behind my ears still stung sharply. Constance and Harold wanted me to hide. They wanted me to feel so humiliated by my appearance that I would retreat into the shadows, allowing them to control the narrative of my absence. "No," I told my friend, gently pushing the scarf away. "I want them to look at exactly what they did." The sun was beginning to set by the time we reached the outskirts of Charlottesville. The storm had finally broken, leaving the evening air thick with humidity. I sat in the passenger seat, mentally preparing for the confrontation with my sister, when the prepaid phone vibrated in my lap. Graham Hale had sent an email to the secure address Naomi provided in her legal notice. I opened the message. There was no greeting and no signature. Graham had simply forwarded a single page from an exception memo drafted by his due diligence accounting team. The memo was generated from a review of the documents Whitaker Heritage had uploaded to the data room. It was not a forensic system log, just a routine flag asking for clarity on a specific piece of paperwork. The highlighted text jumped off the screen. Exception 17. Supporting work paper references legacy approval source MW214. Management clarification required. A second later, a text message from Graham arrived. Your old identifier is appearing in the support they gave our auditors. Either it was never retired properly, or someone wants us to believe you touched this transaction. The tires of Naomi's sedan crunched over the pristine white gravel of the Stonebridge Manor driveway. The sun had completely vanished, leaving the sprawling Virginia estate illuminated by hundreds of golden landscape lights. I stepped out of the passenger seat, keeping the cheap prepaid phone gripped tightly in my right hand. Naomi drove away toward a chain hotel just down the highway, acting as my invisible anchor. Walking through the main service entrance felt like trespassing in a museum dedicated to someone else's life. Event staff rushed past, carrying massive arrangements of white orchids and hydrangeas. The heavy floral scent mixed with the smell of floor wax, instantly clogging my throat. Nobody stopped me. They were too busy staring at my bare, scratched scalp to ask for an invitation. In the grand foyer, a massive digital screen played a continuous loop of family photographs. Harold and Constance smiling on a sailboat. Elise graduating from college. The groom and the bride cutting a cake at their engagement party. I stood there for a full minute, watching 30 years of curated history cycle past. Not a single image included me. They had scrubbed my existence from the brand long before they shaved my head. My burner phone vibrated. Graham Hale had sent a room number. I found the small administrative office tucked behind the main ballroom. Pushing the heavy oak door open, I stepped into a room smelling strongly of bitter coffee and expensive cologne. Graham sat behind a mahogany desk, looking exhausted. His suit jacket hung over the back of a chair, and his tie was loosened. A sleek black speakerphone sat in the center of the desk, glowing with an active call. She is here, Graham announced to the room, leaning back and crossing his arms. A tinny, professional voice echoed from the speaker. It belonged to the transaction attorney, representing Hale Lodging, accompanied by the steady breathing of a lead due diligence accountant. My team flagged the vendor reconciliations early yesterday, Graham explained, keeping his eyes locked on mine. We compared the summarized financial reports your father provided against the raw schedules in the data room. The client deposit numbers do not match the cash reserves. I signed a non-disclosure agreement to investigate the discrepancy quietly, not to help them hide it. He was defending his reputation, making sure I understood he was not a willing participant in my family's fraud. If you know the numbers are wrong, why is the signing still scheduled for noon tomorrow? I asked, pulling a leather chair out and taking a seat. Graham let out a sharp, frustrated breath. Because Harold produced a signed verification letter this afternoon. Your sister and the corporate controller explicitly guaranteed the accuracy of the summary reports. An exception memo from my accountant simply asks for management clarification, and management provided it. I cannot blow up a 9-figure merger based on a suspicious ledger unless I have absolute proof of manipulation. I placed my phone on the desk and opened the digital file Naomi had secured from my personal archives. I pushed the screen toward the groom. Look at the date on this document, I instructed. This is an internal approval for a corporate fund transfer from 12 years ago. Authorized by legacy account MW214. That is my old employee identifier. My parents forced me to resign and revoked my access on October 12th. This transaction was approved on October 14th. Graham picked up the phone, his brow furrowing as he studied the timestamp. Someone inside this company kept my digital identity active after they banished me, I continued, keeping my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. They used my name to approve fraudulent transfers back then. And they are using it in your supporting work papers right now to build a scapegoat. The accountant on the speakerphone cleared his throat, confirming that they would immediately cross-reference the legacy account activity against the current data room uploads. Graham set the phone down gently. He looked at my shaved head, then at my face. Elise told me you were demanding money. She said you threatened to ruin the wedding if Harold refused to pay you off. The lie hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My sister was actively poisoning the groom against me while simultaneously begging for my help. Where is she? I asked, standing up. Graham pointed toward the hallway, leading to the bridal suites. I walked down the long carpeted corridor, my boots sinking into the plush fabric. The door to the primary dressing room stood slightly ajar. I pushed it open. Elise stood in the center of the room, surrounded by garment bags and boxes of expensive shoes. She wore a silk robe, holding a delicate pearl necklace between her manicured fingers. When she turned and saw me, the necklace slipped from her grasp and clattered against the hardwood floor. Her eyes widened, fixing immediately on my bare scalp. Genuine horror washed over her features. She raised a hand to her mouth, taking a trembling step backward. "Mara," my sister gasped, her voice cracking. "I did not know they would go this far. I swear to you, I did not know." I closed the door behind me and locked it. The heavy click echoed loudly in the small mirrored room. "Who dropped the envelope at my apartment on Thursday?" I asked, ignoring her tears. Elise swallowed hard, wrapping her arms around her own waist. "I did. I drove up there and left the note. I needed you to come back before the signing." "And who sent the text message calling me a pathetic psycho and telling me to stay away?" She looked away, staring intently at a rack of bridesmaids' dresses. "Mom took my phone. Constance has been monitoring everything I do. She must have sent it to create a record. It was a convincing performance, built on a foundation of historical truth. Our mother had always invaded our privacy, but I had spent the last decade hunting corporate liars, and my sister was making a critical mistake. I pulled out my burner phone and called Naomi. My attorney answered on the first ring. Before my original phone disappeared, the message and its timestamp had synchronized with the secure account Naomi was preserving for me. "Naomi," I said, putting the call on speaker. "Tell her exactly what we can prove." The lawyer's crisp voice filled the dressing room. "The message was delivered through the account and telephone number associated with Elise," Naomi said. "At this stage, that does not tell us which physical device sent it. Confirming the device will require lawful forensic access later." Constance was appearing on a live stream at the same minute, which makes her explanation less likely, but it does not eliminate every possibility. I kept my eyes on Elise. The technical record was not enough to convict her. Fortunately, Elise had left a more personal signature inside the message. Elise squeezed her eyes shut. Her breathing turned shallow and rapid. "There is one more thing," I added, stepping closer to my sister. "The text message told me to stay away from your wedding, but the sender spelled the word separate with an E instead of an A in the following sentence. It is a very specific typographical error. You have misspelled that exact word since the 5th grade, Elise." The room fell completely silent. The hum of the central air conditioning suddenly sounded like a jet engine. My sister dropped the victim act. Her posture straightened, and the terrified younger sibling vanished, replaced by the incoming president of a corporate empire. "I had to do it," Elise admitted, her voice dropping the trembling entirely. "I needed to make sure Constance and Harold believed I was loyal to them. If you showed up and everything fell apart, I needed a paper trail proving that I ordered you to stay away. I needed them to think you were acting alone." She had weaponized my pain to build herself an escape hatch. Elise wanted me to come back and expose the fraud, taking all the shrapnel from our parents' explosion, while she remained safely behind the shield of plausible deniability. She was preparing to sacrifice me for a second time. A sharp knock on the dressing room door interrupted the heavy silence. "Mara," Graham called out from the hallway. I unlocked the door and let the groom inside. He took one look at Elise's face and understood exactly what was happening. The woman he was supposed to marry in less than 24 hours had been lying to him for months. "This is the only way we survive," Elise argued, looking frantically between Graham and me. "I can get the original statement I signed 12 years ago. The document proving they forced me to frame you. It is locked in the blue room at the house. If you just let me handle the timing, I can hand it to you tomorrow morning." She was negotiating, using the proof of my innocence as currency to buy my silence regarding her current betrayal. My evidence is already backed up on secure legal servers, I told her, keeping my tone completely flat. I will not delete it, and I will not hide it to protect you. But I will give you a choice. Elise stared at me, her chest heaving. You have until 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I continued, outlining the boundary with absolute precision. You will bring me the original statement. You will provide Graham with a complete list of every hidden account. And you will tell him the exact truth about your involvement in preparing those fraudulent work papers. If you do that, we handle this together. If you lie to him again, or if you fail to show up, I hand my entire evidence packet to the authorities and the banking regulators at 9 o'clock. Tears spilled over my sister's eyelashes, ruining her expensive makeup. She lunged forward and wrapped her arms around my neck, burying her face in my shoulder. She sobbed, whispering frantic apologies against my collarbone. I stood perfectly still. I did not raise my arms to hold her. I did not stroke her hair or tell her everything would be fine. I simply waited until she pulled away. Elise grabbed her purse and hurried out of the dressing room, leaving a trail of expensive perfume in her wake. Graham stood near the doorway, watching the empty corridor. The groom looked older than his 36 years, burdened by the sudden weight of a collapsing future. Do you actually trust her? Graham asked softly, turning his attention back to me. I looked at the pearl necklace, still resting on the hardwood floor. I trust that my sister is terrified, I answered, picking up my burner phone. I just do not know if she fears our parents more than she fears losing this merger. Graham nodded slowly, stepping out of the room without another word. He had his own decisions to make, and a billion-dollar empire to protect. I walked out of the venue and headed toward the main highway, walking the short distance to the chain hotel where Naomi had established our command center. The night air felt thick and oppressive, heavy with the promise of more rain. I needed to sleep, but the adrenaline burning through my veins made the concept impossible. When I pushed open the door to room 214, Naomi was sitting at a small laminate desk, surrounded by glowing screens and empty coffee cups. She did not look up when I entered. I just received the high-resolution scan of your old employment file from the corporate archives, the attorney announced, her voice tight with a strange, dark energy. I pulled the original statement Elise signed 12 years ago, the one claiming she saw you stealing data. And? I asked, dropping my bag onto the nearest bed. Naomi turned her laptop screen toward me. She had magnified a specific section of the digital document. She misspelled separate in the official statement, just like she did in the text message, Naomi confirmed. But that is not the problem. The attorney tapped a key, bringing up a second document alongside the first. It was a copy of the fund approval form authorizing the fraudulent community grant from a decade ago. The document bore my signature at the bottom of the page. I had a forensic document examiner look at this signature an hour ago, Naomi explained, pointing a pen at the looping letters of my name. This is not a copy and paste job from your legitimate personnel files. Someone manually forged your signature. They built it by practicing the specific curves of your handwriting. I leaned closer to the bright screen, staring at the ink. The M in my first name had a very distinct, sharp hook at the top left corner. It was a stylistic flourish I had developed in high school. My stomach plummeted, hitting the floor with terrifying force. When we were children, sitting at the kitchen table on rainy afternoons, Elise used to practice forging my signature on my birthday cards. She would spend hours copying that exact, sharp hook, treating it like a game of artistic mimicry. My parents had not forged the document that ruined my life. The woman who just hugged me and cried on my shoulder in the dressing room had drawn the weapon herself. The glowing screen of Naomi's laptop illuminated the sterile hotel room, casting harsh shadows against the cheap floral wallpaper. I stared at the digital document for a long time, my eyes locked on the sharp, distinctive hook forming the top corner of the letter M. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. My memory pulled me back to a rainy Tuesday afternoon 20 years ago. Two sisters sitting at a massive mahogany dining table, surrounded by scattered crayons and birthday cards. Elise had spent hours practicing that exact signature, treating my handwriting like a puzzle she needed to solve. She had giggled every time she perfected that specific hook, proud of her ability to mimic my identity. the woman who raised us did not forge the document that authorized the stolen community funds. My little sister did. Naomi reached out and gently closed the laptop lid, cutting off the blinding light. The attorney explained that a preliminary review by a document expert confirmed the signature was not a digital copy pasted from my personnel file. The ink strokes demonstrated hesitation marks and unnatural pressure points, proving someone had physically drawn the letters to construct the forgery. A heavy knock on the hotel room door interrupted the silence. I walked over and checked the peephole. Graham Hale stood in the hallway, looking completely wrecked. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open, stepping aside to let the groom enter our makeshift command center. Graham did not bother with pleasantries. He dropped a thick manila folder onto the small laminate desk and ran a hand over his face. His due diligence team had spent the last 4 hours digging past the surface level of the data room. The accountants had compared the multiple versions of the financial spreadsheets Whitaker Heritage had uploaded over the past month. By analyzing the portal metadata, the Hale team discovered that massive alterations had been executed using corporate credentials belonging directly to Elise. She did not just find out about this fraud a few weeks ago, Graham said, his voice completely hollow. The version history shows a pattern stretching back 3 years. Elise manually altered the descriptions on dozens of vendor invoices. She systematically took legitimate supplier complaints and buried them under a category labeled as deferred event expenses. The bride had been actively managing the cover-up for years, carefully balancing the toxic ledgers while smiling for the engagement cameras. Graham realized the woman he was scheduled to marry in less than 12 hours had personally signed fraudulent declarations, intentionally feeding his family corrupted financial data. Before anyone could process the weight of that revelation, my burner phone vibrated on the nightstand. A text message from Elise glowed on the screen, asking for my room number. She claimed she had the evidence. Naomi and Graham moved into the small adjoining seating area, keeping out of immediate sight. I unlocked the door and left it slightly ajar, sitting on the edge of the mattress to wait. 5 minutes later, Elise slipped into the room. She wore a heavy trench coat over her clothes, glancing nervously down the empty hallway before shutting the door. Reaching into her pocket, my sister pulled out a small silver flash drive and set it carefully on the glass coffee table. "This is everything," Elise whispered, looking at me with wide, desperate eyes. "The drive contains emails between Constance and Harold. It proves they planned the data breach 12 years ago. It proves they forced me to sign that witness statement against you." I looked at the piece of metal, feeling absolutely nothing resembling gratitude. "Did they also force you to forge my signature on the fund approval document?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. Elise froze. The blood drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking pale and fragile in the harsh hotel lighting. She opened her mouth to speak, closed it, and finally looked down at her hands. "They told me we would lose the house," she stammered, stepping backward. "Harold said the auditors were coming, and someone had to take the blame. You were already leaving. You were always the strong one, Mara. You could handle it." I had nothing but their approval. The excuse was sickeningly familiar, a perfect echo of the logic our parents used to justify every terrible thing they had ever done. "I left this family so I could survive," I told her, standing up and closing the distance between us. "I did not leave, so you could use my name to cover your crimes. I am not responsible for the choices you made to protect your inheritance. Why do the strong always have to be the ones who suffer?" Elise demanded, hot tears spilling over her cheeks. "You walked away and built a perfect life. I stayed in that house, suffocating under their rules every single day. I had to do whatever they asked. I refused to accept the guilt she was trying to hand me." The boundaries were finally clear. "You have 1 hour," I stated, drawing the absolute final line. "Go back to the Blue Room and get the original physical statement you signed 12 years ago. Bring it to this hotel, hand over the rest of the accounts, and tell Graham the truth. If you do that, we deal with the authorities together." It was a massive tactical error, born entirely from a lingering, foolish hope that a small piece of my sister still existed beneath the corporate programming. I gave her an hour of privacy, trusting she would make the right choice, but I was not entirely naive. Before Elise turned and rushed out of the hotel room, I slid the silver flash drive into my pocket. The heavy door clicked shut. Graham stepped out from the adjoining space, his expression hardened into something resembling cold granite. Naomi immediately took the flash drive from my hand and plugged it into a secure, isolated port on her laptop. For 20 minutes, the room remained quiet, save for the rhythmic clicking of Naomi's keyboard. The attorney ran a rapid diagnostic sweep on the files, verifying the contents. Suddenly, Naomi cursed under her breath. "We have a major problem," my friend announced, turning the screen toward Graham and me. I was monitoring the cloud directory linked to the documents Elise just gave us. A master folder just changed ownership, and several key files vanished from the directory in real time. Elise had not gone back to the estate to retrieve the physical statement. She had gone back to activate a digital trap. Naomi pulled up the access log, tracing the command that initiated the deletion. The manipulation did not originate from Constance or Harold. The forensic trail led directly to a brand new user profile created on the Whitaker Heritage servers. The username was terrifyingly familiar, MW214. This account was not created 12 years ago, Naomi explained, pointing to the creation date stamped in the system registry. Someone registered this specific profile exactly 6 weeks ago. My pulse hammered against my ribs. 6 weeks ago was precisely the moment the Hale Lodging merger moved into the final, aggressive due diligence phase. Elise had not created the fake legacy account in a panic over the last 2 days. She had been building a digital cage for me for over a month, preparing the trap long before she ever dropped that manila envelope on my welcome mat in Arlington. The attorney kept digging through the recovered cache, restoring a deleted subfolder before the server could completely overwrite the data. A single document appeared on the screen. It was a draft of a corporate press release, authored entirely by Elise. Graham leaned over the desk, reading the words aloud. The statement detailed a tragic security breach. It claimed that a disgruntled former employee named Mara Whitaker had maliciously hacked into the corporate servers on the eve of the wedding. The draft accused me of manipulating financial data and altering vendor invoices in a desperate attempt to extort the family and destroy the merger. The entire architecture of my sister's plan finally became visible, laid bare under the hotel lights. Elise never intended to escape our parents by simply telling the truth. She needed a catalyst. She wanted me to discover the missing money and expose the fraud to the auditors, triggering the investigation that would bring Harold and Constance down. But the moment the authorities arrived, Elise planned to release this statement. She was going to use my presence at the venue, my old employee badge, and the newly created legacy account to prove I was the mastermind behind the entire disaster. She intended to walk away from the wreckage as the innocent, victimized bride, while I took the fall for a decade of corporate theft. Graham stared at the drafted press release for a long time. The groom slowly reached down to his left hand. He grasped the heavy gold engagement band resting on his ring finger, twisted it past his knuckle, and pulled it off. He placed the ring quietly on the edge of the laminate desk. He did not say a word, but the silence confirmed that the wedding was officially dead. "There is something else in the cache," Naomi murmured, her fingers flying across the trackpad. An audio file icon appeared on the desktop. The system indicated the recording had been captured and saved to the secret directory 2 days ago, right before I arrived at the estate. Naomi double-clicked the icon, and the tinny, compressed sound of a hidden microphone filled the room. 2 voices echoed from the laptop speakers. Constance and Elise were arguing in a hushed, frantic tone inside what sounded like a large closet. The matriarch was attempting to calm her daughter down, promising that the situation with Mara would be handled smoothly before the rehearsal dinner. Constance detailed the dosage of the sedative, explaining exactly how they would construct the fake video to discredit me. I waited for my sister to scream. I waited for Elise to threaten the police, to beg our mother to stop, to do absolutely anything to protect the sibling she had just summoned for help. Instead, Elise's voice cut through the recording, completely devoid of empathy. "I know what you plan to do to her," the bride whispered, her tone chillingly practical. "Just make sure she can still walk into the wedding if I need her there." The audio file ended, leaving only the soft hiss of static hanging in the air. My sister knew they were going to drug me. Elise knew they were going to hold me down and shave my head, stripping away my dignity to build a false narrative. She did not try to stop the assault. She only asked that they preserve my physical mobility, ensuring I could still serve my purpose as the ultimate scapegoat for her crimes. Morning light bled through the gaps in the heavy hotel curtains, casting a pale gray wash over the laminate desk where Naomi Pierce sat working. Saturday had finally arrived. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the impending collision of 12 years of secrets and a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition. Naomi pressed the final execution command on her keyboard just as the digital clock on the television stand turned to 8 in the morning. The evidence packets were officially out in the world. My attorney did not send the files to the local press or the society bloggers who were eagerly anticipating the wedding of the season. She deployed the information like a scalpel, sending the time-stamped forensic logs, the audio recordings, and the verified medical reports directly to the transaction counsel representing Hale Lodging. Simultaneous copies went to the underwriting banks, the corporate insurance providers, and the single independent board member sitting on the Whitaker Heritage Oversight Committee. The packets contained no emotional pleas, just raw data accompanied by a formal preservation demand. While Naomi secured the digital perimeter, I stood in the small bathroom and submitted my supplemental assault report to the local detective over a recorded phone line. I detailed the hidden audio file Elise had left on the servers, confirming my sister knew about the physical attack before it happened. I hung up the phone and looked at my reflection in the cheap mirror. The scratches on my scalp had scabbed over into thin, angry red lines. I pulled the heavy navy blue dress from its plastic garment bag and slipped it on. The dark fabric felt cool and armored against my skin. I did not reach for the silk scarf Naomi had offered the day before. The people who had tried to strip away my dignity were going to look at exactly what they had done. 30 minutes later, my boots hit the marble floors of Stonebridge Manor. The air conditioning swept over my bare head the moment I pushed through the heavy wooden doors. The grand foyer was packed with event staff, minor executives, and early arriving guests. The heavy scent of white gardenias instantly coated the back of my throat. When the crowd noticed me, a collective intake of breath sucked the oxygen out of the room, followed immediately by the rapid clicking of promotional cameras. Harold and Constance moved through the crowd like sharks scenting blood in the water. My mother wore her compassionate smile, whispering loudly about my mental state, while my father signaled the security guards to physically remove me from the venue. I stood my ground and reminded the head of security about the liability of touching a victim with an active assault report. The guards froze. Before my father could issue another command, the polished veneer of the morning completely fractured. A cell phone rang from the far side of the lobby. The transaction attorney representing Hale Lodging pulled his device from his pocket, his eyes widening as he read the incoming message. A second later, Harold felt a vibration inside his suit jacket. My father answered the call, listened for exactly 5 seconds, and turned the color of wet ash. The bank had frozen the disbursement of the acquisition funds. The noon signing ceremony was officially suspended. Elise appeared at the top of the grand staircase, wearing a dress woven from thousands of dollars of white lace and silk. She froze when she saw the chaos unfolding below. Graham Hale stepped out of the adjacent administrative office, taking in the sight of my bare head, the panicked lawyers, and the furious expression on my father's face. The groom walked straight through the crowd and stopped in front of his bride. "Did you know they attacked her?" Graham asked, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the confused guests. Elise widened her eyes, pressing a trembling hand against her chest. "Graham, I have no idea what is going on. My sister is deeply unwell. She needs help." I did not raise my voice to argue with her, and I did not play the audio recording over the venue speakers for the crowd to hear. The public spectacle was irrelevant now. I pulled a pair of wireless earbuds from my clutch and walked over to the groom. I handed one earpiece to Graham and the other to his lead attorney, tapping the play button on my phone screen. The two men stood in the center of the Apple lavish foyer, Appelen, Apple after, Apple's 2x lavish foyer, listening to the private conversation Elise had recorded in the closet with Constance 2 days ago. They heard my sister explicitly acknowledge the plan to drug me. They heard the bride demand that our mother leave me capable of walking into the venue, ensuring I could still serve as the perfect corporate scapegoat. Graham pulled the small white speaker from his ear. He stared at the woman in the white dress like she was a stranger holding a knife. "You used her," the groom whispered, the realization draining the last ounce of warmth from his voice. You view your own sister as a tool for your survival. That is not true, Elise cried, taking a frantic step down the staircase. You do not understand the pressure they put on me. I had no choice. I stepped around Graham and looked up at the bride. The time for private negotiations and emotional blackmail had expired. The evidence packet has already been delivered to the banks and the board of directors, I told Elise, laying out the brutal reality of her situation. The data cannot be recalled. You have exactly one choice left. You can voluntarily hand over the original physical statement you signed 12 years ago, turn over your administrative access codes, and correct your testimony on the record. My sister gripped the wooden banister, her knuckles turning completely white. Or you can keep denying it, I continued, offering no comfort and no promises of immunity. You can stand there and let the federal investigators read the forensic logs detailing the fake account you created to frame me. If you cooperate, you might survive the fallout. But I am not going to protect you from the consequences of your own actions. Elise looked at the faces staring up at her. She saw the disgust in Graham's posture and the cold calculation in Harold's eyes. Reaching into a hidden pocket sewn into the folds of her massive gown, the bride pulled out a folded piece of heavy stock paper. She walked down the remaining stairs and handed the document to me. I wrote a new statement this morning, Elise offered, her voice dropping into a desperate, pleading whisper. I signed it and had the event coordinator witness it. I admitted that Constance and Harold pressured me to lie about the data theft 12 years ago. I took responsibility for the false testimony. I unfolded the paper and scanned the paragraphs. The confession was beautifully crafted, filled with expressions of deep remorse and familial trauma. But it was a masterpiece of omission. The document completely ignored the fraudulent legacy account created 6 weeks ago. It made no mention of the forged signature on the community grant approval, and it conveniently bypassed her 3-year history of altering vendor invoices in the corporate ledgers. Elise was still trying to edit the truth, offering a minor sacrifice to protect her incoming presidency. Keep the details about the fake account in the family, Mara, my sister begged, stepping dangerously close to my shoulder. Please. If Graham sees that part, I lose everything. I looked at the incomplete confession in my hand, feeling a profound sense of exhaustion wash over me. The girl who used to practice my signature at the kitchen table was completely gone, replaced by a woman who would always treat the truth as a negotiable currency. I cannot use this, I replied, holding the paper out toward her. A half-truth is just a liability wrapped in an apology. Graham stepped forward, intercepting the document before Elise could grab it. The groom did not even bother to read the paragraphs. He simply folded the heavy paper in half and placed it on the silver tray of a passing waiter. Reaching up to his lapel, Graham unpinned the expensive white orchid boutonniere and dropped it onto the marble floor. The transaction is dead, Harold, the groom announced, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous space. And there will be no wedding today. Elise let out a sharp, devastated sob. She lunged forward, grabbing the sleeve of Graham's jacket. You cannot do this. Mara is manipulating you. She came back here specifically to destroy us because she is jealous of what we built. Graham gently detached her fingers from his suit. He did not deliver a long, dramatic speech about betrayal or broken hearts. He simply looked at the woman he had loved and delivered the final, fatal blow to her narrative. Your draft email said Mara altered the vendor invoices to extort the family, Graham stated, his tone completely flat. But my accountants found your digital footprint on every single altered ledger. You were planning to release a statement accusing your sister of the exact crime you committed. The bride collapsed backward against the wooden staircase, her hands covering her face. The wedding had officially died before a single note of music played. Harold watched the destruction of his empire unfold in real time. The patriarch realized that the Hale family money was gone. The merger was canceled, and the criminal investigators were already circling the property. Panic, raw and unfiltered, finally cracked his arrogant facade. He needed a sacrifice to save himself, and his eldest daughter was no longer available. My father turned his attention entirely to my mother. This is your fault, Harold snarled, pointing a trembling finger at Constance. You lost control of the situation. You organized the assault on Mara. You ordered the medication, and you held the clippers. I had nothing to do with that madness. Constance stared at her husband, her flawless posture rigid with shock. Harold reached into his jacket and pulled out his smartphone. He looked directly at the lead transaction attorney representing the Hale family, desperate to establish his innocence regarding the physical attack. I have proof, my father declared loudly. I recorded a conversation in our private suite last night. I only wanted to frighten Mara into leaving the property. Constance is the one who took it too far. Listen to this. Harold tapped the screen of his device, turning the volume to the maximum level. The recording began to play, filling the silent foyer with the sound of my parents arguing behind closed doors. But my father, in his absolute desperation to throw his wife to the wolves, had failed to edit the beginning of the file. The audio started with Harold's own voice, loud and clear. The old story would work again, the recorded version of my father promised. We just need her incapacitated long enough to get the photos. Once everyone sees she relapsed, nobody will believe a word she says about the foundation money. A collective gasp rippled through the remaining guests. Harold fumbled with the phone, frantically trying to pause the playback, but his thumb slipped against the glass screen. He had just publicly admitted to orchestrating the physical assault and directly tied the attack to the stolen foundation funds. He had provided the exact motive the police needed to execute a search warrant. My father stood frozen in the center of the lobby, realizing he had just locked his own prison cell. Constance stopped crying. The matriarch lowered her hands from her face, and the terrified, overwhelmed expression completely vanished. She looked at the man she had been married to for 40 years, her eyes hardening into shards of absolute ice. You kept insurance against me, my mother observed, her voice deadly calm and echoing with the finality of a judge delivering a sentence. Good. She turned away from Harold and locked eyes with her own private defense attorney standing near the coat check. Call the bank in Richmond, Constance commanded, loud enough for every person in the room to hear. Tell the vault manager I am ready to open the safe deposit box. The one my husband never knew I had. I kept the real books against you, Harold, and I am turning them all over today. The marble foyer of Stonebridge Manor rapidly transformed from a wedding reception into an evacuation zone. Guests murmured in hushed, frantic tones, gathering their coats and avoiding eye contact with the center of the room. The catering staff quietly wheeled untouched champagne towers back toward the service kitchens. Nobody wanted to be caught in the blast radius of a collapsing dynasty. Constance did not look at the fleeing crowd. The matriarch kept her gaze fixed on the independent board member and the Hale transaction attorneys. Her private counsel, a sharp-featured man in a charcoal suit, immediately stepped forward to verify the existence of the safe deposit box in Richmond. He assured the legal teams that a formal chain of custody would be established within the hour. Harold controlled every single transaction, my mother stated, smoothing the front of her expensive gown. Her voice sounded remarkably steady, completely devoid of the panic that had consumed her husband. I simply signed the philanthropic summaries he placed on my desk. The real ledgers, along with the detailed exposure matrix, transferring his assets offshore, are locked in that vault. I secured those documents because I suspected he was preparing to abandon this company. I listened to the woman who raised me effortlessly rewrite history. The timeline did not align. If Constance had managed to secure a matrix of hidden offshore accounts, she had known about the financial rot for years, not days. She had knowingly smiled for the cameras, endorsing a fraudulent corporate narrative while quietly building a parachute made of evidence against her own husband. Harold refused to go down alone. The patriarch shoved his phone back into his jacket and let out a harsh, bitter laugh. You managed the public image of the foundation, Constance, my father fired back, turning toward the board member. You personally signed the grant approvals for those fake community projects. You are not a victim of my accounting, and you certainly orchestrated the physical attack on Mara. He reached into his pocket again, retrieving a small leather notebook, and pulled out a folded printout of an internal email. Harold shoved the paper toward the Hale attorneys. Read it, Harold demanded, his face flushed dark red. That is an email Constance sent to the public relations team 3 days ago. She explicitly ordered them to prepare a press release detailing Mara experiencing a severe psychological relapse. She engineered the entire narrative. The two of them stood in the wreckage of their empire, actively trading pieces of evidence to destroy each other. They had spent decades presenting a united front of perfect family values, but beneath the glossy surface, they had always viewed one another as a liability waiting to detonate. Elise watched her parents tear each other apart. The bride realized she was running out of time to secure her own immunity. If Harold and Constance were willing to surrender their deepest secrets, they would not hesitate to sacrifice their youngest daughter to lighten their own sentences. My sister grabbed her purse from the staircase railing and pulled out her smartphone. She typed furiously for several seconds, then looked up at the independent board member. "I just emailed you a secure link," Elise announced, her voice trembling just enough to project absolute terror. "It is a cloud directory containing 3 years of internal communications, audio recordings, and original ledgers. I have been collecting this data to protect myself. My parents forced me to alter those invoices, and that vault contains the proof." Elise firmly believed the massive data dump would instantly transform her into the star witness of the federal investigation. She expected the lawyers to thank her for her bravery. Naomi Pierce stepped out of the shadows near the coat check. "My attorney did not look impressed. Nobody opens that link until my firm creates a complete forensic image of the directory," Naomi instructed, addressing the Hale legal team. "If we access the live folder, the defense will argue the metadata was contaminated. We secure the digital fingerprint first." The groom stood silently near the doorway, watching Naomi open her laptop on a small decorative table. Graham did not leave the venue, anchored by a grim need to see exactly who he had almost married. 10 minutes passed in agonizing silence. Naomi executed the forensic copy, locking the original files behind an encrypted wall, and began scanning the root directory on her screen. The digital vault Elise had offered as a shield immediately turned into a guillotine. "This is not a whistleblower archive," Naomi murmured, her fingers flying across the trackpad. The file creation dates stretch back nearly 4 years. Elise did not compile this to expose the fraud. She curated it to maintain leverage. My attorney opened a subfolder labeled strictly for personal backups. The screen populated with a terrifying array of evidence. The directory contained the drafted email designed to frame me for a cyber attack, the detailed logs of vendor invoices altered by Elise, and the audio file proving she knew about the plan to drug me. But the most devastating document was a simple, color-coded spreadsheet. Naomi rotated the laptop so the board member, the Hale attorneys, and Graham could clearly see the screen. Elise had built a contingency matrix, charting the potential outcomes of the merger. She had divided the scenarios into 3 distinct columns. The first column detailed a successful closing. The second column analyzed a partial audit failure. The third column, highlighted in bright green, bore a chilling title: "Mara exposes parents. Elise remains protected." My sister had calculated the exact blast radius of my return. She had quantified my pain, projecting how my confrontation with our parents would distract the auditors long enough for her to secure her position as the innocent survivor. The spreadsheet listed the fake legacy account as a primary asset in this specific scenario. The silence in the grand foyer became absolute. The catering manager quietly signaled his staff to stop serving alcohol while the venue determined whether the event would continue. The independent board member did not pretend he could remove 3 senior officers by himself. He called the board chair and invoked the company's emergency preservation protocol. Outside counsel instructed Whitaker Heritage to freeze administrative changes, preserve every server, and temporarily suspend Harold, Constance, and Elise from accessing corporate records until the full board could meet. The Hale attorneys acted within their own authority. They formally suspended the closing and instructed the lender and transaction insurer not to release funds while the source documents were being examined. The acquisition was not legally terminated in that instant, but it could no longer proceed that day. The sponsors did not tear their logos down in the foyer. Their cancellation notices arrived later, after their attorneys reviewed the evidence, and the wedding collapse became public. There were no handcuffs either. Complex financial crimes required subpoenas, forensic accounting, witness interviews, but Harold's money was frozen, Elise's wedding was over, and none of them could touch the records they had spent years manipulating. My family stood in the center of the massive room, completely stripped of their power, their money, and their carefully constructed masks. Constance broke the silence first. The matriarch walked slowly toward me, her champagne gown whispering against the marble. She reached out, her hands trembling, and tried to grab my arm. "Mara, you have to tell the investigators that Harold manipulated all of us," my mother pleaded, the polished veneer finally cracking into raw desperation. "You know how controlling your father can be. Tell them I was just trying to keep the family together, please." Before I could step away from her grasp, Harold pushed past the board member and aggressively stepped into my line of sight. "Do not listen to her," my father demanded, his voice echoing loudly. "You saw the email, Mara. Constance organized the attack on you. Elise altered those invoices on her own. Tell the board that your mother and your sister orchestrated this entire collapse." Elise lunged forward, wedging herself between our parents. The bride looked at me with wide, panicked eyes. The heavy white lace of her dress stained with spilled water from a discarded glass. "I am a victim in this house too," my sister cried, her voice breaking. "You know what they are capable of. You know they forced me to sign that statement 12 years ago. Please, Mara, just remember that I am your sister." They surrounded me, a desperate trinity of betrayal, each one begging me to validate their specific version of the truth. They wanted me to choose a favorite monster. They expected me to edit the narrative, to cut out the pieces of evidence that would harm the parent or sibling I loved the most, just like I had always done when I was younger. I looked at the woman who helped shave my head, the man who stole my identity, and the sister who built a cage for me to rot inside. "I am not going to choose," I told them, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I am going to hand every single piece of evidence to the federal prosecutors, and I am not going to cut a single second of audio to protect any of you. You are going to face the exact truth you created." That was the core of my revenge. I was not going to destroy them with a lie. I was simply going to stop hiding their reality from the world. Naomi tapped the edge of the table, drawing the attention of the remaining lawyers. "We have the forensic origin of the fake legacy account," my attorney announced, reading a fresh log from the server diagnostic. The profile MW214 was not created by Harold or Constance. The system registry confirms the account was generated on a laptop, assigned directly to the vice president of brand management. The creation date is exactly 6 weeks ago. Elise flinched as if she had been struck. The vice president of brand management was her official corporate title. She had built the digital frame job 6 weeks before she ever dropped that manila envelope on my welcome mat. The plea for help was never real. The entire operation was a calculated, premeditated snare, designed to ensure I took the fall for a decade of missing money. Graham Hale did not ask any more questions. The groom looked at the woman in the white dress one final time, turned around, and walked out of the heavy wooden doors. He did not say goodbye. I spent the next 3 hours sitting in a small, windowless security office with Naomi, answering questions from a senior investigator with the State Financial Crimes Division. We provided the timestamps, the audio files, and the verified medical reports. The investigator took meticulous notes, outlining the lengthy legal process that would consume the next year of our lives. By the time we finally walked out of the manor, the sun had set completely. The estate grounds were dark, save for the golden landscape lights illuminating the empty driveway. The massive white event tent stood abandoned on the great lawn, rippling quietly in the evening breeze. I walked toward the passenger side of Naomi's car, the gravel crunching softly beneath my boots. The cool night air felt clean against my bare scalp, and for the first time in 2 days, the tight knot of anxiety in my chest began to loosen. "Mara, wait." The voice came from the shadows near the grand stone fountain. Elise stepped into the light, shivering in the damp air. She had taken off the massive wedding gown, replacing it with a simple gray sweater and dark jeans. The heavy, elaborate makeup was completely gone, leaving her face pale and exhausted. My sister stopped 10 feet away from the car. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of yellowed, heavy stock paper. It was not the fake confession she had written that morning. It was the original, physical statement she had signed 12 years ago. The document containing the forged signature and the lies that destroyed my career. Elise held the paper up, her hands trembling slightly in the cool breeze. "Tell the investigators I was entirely coerced into making those accounting changes," my sister demanded, her voice tight with a strange, desperate defiance. "Tell them I was a victim of their control, and I will hand you the file that clears your name completely." I stopped with my hand resting on the door handle of the sedan. I looked at the young woman standing in the gravel, realizing she had learned absolutely nothing from the collapse of her empire. "Refuse," Elise continued, her grip tightening on the yellowed paper, "and you may never find it." My sister was still holding the truth hostage, using the proof of my innocence as currency to buy her own freedom. I stood in the quiet darkness, looking at the person I had driven through a storm to save, and realized the hardest decision was still waiting to be made. The yellowed paper trembled in my sister's hand, catching the pale glow of the security light overhead. Elise looked desperate, waiting for me to lunge forward, reach for the document, and grant her the absolution she craved. She believed the ghost of our past was still a leash she could use to pull me back into her orbit. I did not take a step forward. I kept my hand resting lightly on the cold door handle of Naomi's sedan. "Keep the paper, Elise," I said, my voice cutting through the damp night air with absolute clarity. "I do not need to buy my truth from you anymore." My sister blinked, her expression hardening from panic into genuine confusion. She had spent her entire life believing that every person had a price, and that affection, loyalty, and silence were commodities to be traded. "If I do not hand this over, the board will take months to find the backup files," Elise argued, stepping closer, her voice rising in pitch. "You will stay under suspicion. Your career will remain tied to this wreckage. The investigators already recovered the system backups from Constance's bank vault and Harold's office server," I told her, opening the car door and sliding into the passenger seat. "They did not need your permission to find the truth, and they certainly do not need your terms." Naomi shifted the car into reverse, the tires crunching softly against the gravel as we pulled away from the fountain. I watched my sister through the side window. Elise remained standing alone in the dark, clutching the useless piece of paper against her chest, realizing for the first time that her leverage had completely vanished. The months that followed were defined not by dramatic courtroom showdowns, but by the slow, grinding machinery of federal investigations and corporate audits. Spring melted into the humid haze of summer, and the quiet rhythm of my life in Arlington returned. Though the interior landscape had fundamentally shifted, Naomi handled the formal legal filings, while state and federal financial crimes divisions picked apart the corpse of Whitaker Heritage. Forensic accountants spent weeks wading through digital ledgers, bank statements, and shell company registries, systematically dismantling the financial architecture my father had spent decades building. I was interviewed 3 separate times by federal agents. Each session required me to sit across a metal table and hand over digital devices, encrypted communications logs, and medical records detailing the assault. I did not embellish my statements, and I did not ask for updates on what was happening to my family. I simply provided the facts, letting the system do the work I had once tried to shoulder alone. By early autumn, the independent board of directors at Whitaker Heritage forced a complete restructuring of the corporate entity. The 6 resort properties were placed under independent receivership to protect the remaining client deposits and satisfy outstanding vendor debts. A massive, comprehensive forensic report officially cleared my name, confirming that my digital identity had been hijacked 12 years prior to authorize the very crimes I had refused to sign off on. The legal noose tightened around the 3 primary architects of my family's ruin as the months ticked forward into winter and spring. Harold attempted to cut a deal early, flooding the prosecutor's office with documents designed to paint Constance as the operational mastermind behind the fund transfers. But my mother's hidden safety deposit box contained an exposure matrix that mapped out every fraudulent transaction directly to my father's private signature. Neither of them could outrun the paper trail they had spent a lifetime accumulating. Elise tried to delay her proceedings by presenting letters from defense psychologists, arguing that she was a psychological captive of her parents. But the digital forensic trail told a different story. The metadata extracted from her laptop proved she had initiated the fake legacy account weeks before the merger, deliberately planning to frame me while playing the role of a desperate bride seeking help. By May, the plea agreements and judicial rulings finally locked into place. Harold faced the heaviest penalties. The federal judge handed down a substantial prison sentence for systemic wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate conspiracy, ensuring my father would spend his final productive years behind bars. His personal assets were entirely liquidated to satisfy creditors, leaving him completely bankrupt. Constance received a significant prison term for her direct role in the financial fraud, alongside concurrent sentences for orchestrating the illegal drugging and assault against me. Her request for home confinement was swiftly denied by the prosecution, who highlighted the premeditated nature of the physical attack and her continuous attempts to shift blame onto others. Elise faced a lighter sentence than our parents due to her eventual cooperation, but the court offered no mercy for her role in the forgery and the framing plot. She received a period of strict probation, mandated community service, and a lifetime ban from holding any corporate position involving financial management. The luxury lifestyle, the high-profile social standing, and the corporate presidency evaporated overnight. Graham Hale never looked back, and the wedding that was supposed to merge two empires became a permanent cautionary tale in the regional business community. A week before the formal sentencing hearings concluded, an unexpected letter arrived at my apartment in Arlington. The envelope bore no return address, but I recognized the looping, rushed handwriting immediately. I sat at my kitchen counter, staring at the thick white paper for several minutes before sliding my finger under the flap to open it. Elise had written a final plea, though it contained no requests for money, no demands for silence, and no threats. "I kept telling myself you were stronger, so hurting you cost less," my sister wrote in the center of the page. That was the lie I inherited from them, and the lie I chose to keep using until there was nothing left to break. I set the letter down on the granite counter next to my coffee mug. The words acknowledged the rot at the center of our upbringing, but an explanation was not an apology, and a confession did not erase the wreckage. I did not pick up the phone, and I did not draft a reply. Some bridges are not meant to be rebuilt, and some relationships are damaged beyond the reach of forgiveness. The final administrative task of the ordeal arrived on a bright morning in June. An official, embossed document from the Regional Corporate Oversight Committee dropped into my mailbox. It was a formal letter of correction and public exoneration. The organization sent the document to every business association, professional network, and financial institution that had received the defamatory rumors my parents planted a decade ago. The letter formally confirmed that Mara Whitaker had never manipulated internal ledgers, had never stolen corporate funds, and had been wrongfully driven from her position by fraudulent administrative actions. I held the heavy paper in my hands, reading the crisp black ink from top to bottom. It did not magically restore the 12 years of professional isolation I had endured, and it could not buy back the quiet years I spent hiding from my own past. But it gave me back the absolute ownership of my name. A prominent professional organization in Washington reached out a few days later, inviting me to deliver a keynote address on corporate compliance and internal fraud detection. I declined the invitation politely. I had no desire to turn my survival into a motivational brand or monetize the trauma of my family's collapse. I walked into my home office, carrying the letter of exoneration alongside the old, worn employee badge I had kept locked in my desk drawer. My fingers brushed against the hardened plastic of badge number MW214. The edges were still dull and scratched from the years I spent carrying it through the executive corridors of Whitaker Heritage. I opened a small, polished wooden box sitting on the corner of the shelf and placed both items inside, closing the lid with a soft, final click. I walked over to the large bay window of my apartment, looking out at the steady flow of traffic moving along the highway below. The Virginia sunlight caught the short, even strands of my hair, which had grown back into a practical, neat cut over the past 15 months. I wore the style not as a statement or a scar, but simply as a choice I made for myself. For 12 years, the people who raised me had operated on a simple, brutal formula, deciding which daughter could be sacrificed to keep the family standing. They built their entire legacy on the quiet assumption that I would always absorb the blows so the brand could survive. In the end, I did not tear that family down. I simply stopped holding it up. A few weeks after I placed the old badge and the letter of exoneration inside the wooden box, Naomi called with the final update from the court-appointed receiver. I was sitting at my kitchen counter with a compliance report open beside my coffee when her name appeared on the screen. For one brief moment, I considered letting the call go to voicemail. Every conversation about Whitaker Heritage seemed to pull me back toward a building I had already escaped. But Naomi had never contacted me without a reason. "The liquidation is complete," she said after I answered. "The receiver filed the final distribution report this morning." I closed the report in front of me, and listened. The remaining Whitaker Heritage properties had been sold under court supervision. None of the resorts had been purchased by relatives, hidden partners, or shell companies connected to Harold. The receiver had rejected every last-minute attempt to keep fragments of the business inside the family's control. The proceeds went first to the people who had been treated as disposable. Outstanding vendors were paid. Couples whose wedding deposits had been trapped in frozen accounts received refunds. Employees recovered part of the wages and benefits that Harold had delayed while pretending the company remained financially healthy. Small businesses that had provided flowers, food, linens, furniture, security, transportation, and maintenance finally received checks for invoices that had been ignored for months. The surviving properties reopened under new ownership, but the Whitaker name was removed from every corporate charter, operating agreement, and entrance sign. There would be no family empire left for anyone to inherit, no throne for Elise to reclaim, no boardroom for Harold to control from prison, no charitable platform for Constance to rebuild around a revised version of the truth. When Naomi finished explaining the numbers, she paused. "You are very quiet," she said. "I'm thinking about the couples," I answered. For years, my father had treated client deposits like temporary loans. He moved money from one event to cover another, assuming future bookings would repair every hole he created. The people planning weddings had been reduced to rows on a spreadsheet. Their excitement, savings, and trust mattered only as long as they kept cash moving through his system. Now they were finally getting their money back. That mattered to me more than watching the resorts disappear. A family business could be rebuilt under another name. A reputation could be polished. A ruined wedding, an unpaid payroll, or a small company forced into bankruptcy could not be dismissed as a temporary accounting problem. The people my father had treated as numbers did not have to absorb the final cost of his decisions. Harold entered a federal correctional facility appropriate for his sentence and security classification. Naomi occasionally received notices when his attorneys filed another motion or attempted another appeal. Each filing offered a slightly different explanation. The accountants had misunderstood his instructions. The employees had moved money without authorization. Constance had controlled the foundation. Elise had altered records to protect her future position. I had returned to destroy the company and manipulated the evidence afterward. Every version changed the supporting details, but the center remained the same. Harold was never responsible. In his mind, responsibility belonged to whichever person stood closest when the consequences arrived. He continued writing letters to former board members and business contacts, asking them to confirm that he had been a respected leader. Most went unanswered. A few were forwarded to prosecutors because they contained indirect requests to coordinate stories. The man who had once controlled every conversation was reduced to sending explanations that nobody was required to believe. What he never wrote was the only thing that might have mattered. He never admitted that he had made deliberate choices. He had not accidentally kept my account active after forcing me out. He had not mistakenly used foundation money for a private development. He had not misunderstood the purpose of the fake ledgers. He had chosen each step because he believed the people around him were assets he could spend. Constance entered custody, still insisting that everything she had done was meant to protect the family. Her attorneys emphasized her age, her community work, and the years she had spent speaking about marriage, motherhood, and charitable responsibility. They submitted photographs of fundraising dinners and letters from people who remembered her as gracious and generous. The court considered those materials. Then it returned to the evidence. The altered medication, the recording made before I lost consciousness, the planning behind the assault, the staged video, the prepared statement describing my supposed psychological relapse, the effort to use an old lie to silence me before the merger closed. Her public reputation could not reduce the weight of those facts. For most of her adult life, Constance had survived by controlling the emotional meaning of what happened. If she hurt someone, she called it protection. If she silenced someone, she called it loyalty. If she destroyed a relationship, she said she had been forced to preserve the family. Inside a courtroom, intention could not be rewritten through tone of voice. The evidence remained the evidence. Elise avoided the prison term our parents received, but cooperation did not restore the life she had expected to inherit. She remained under strict supervision, paid restitution, completed court-ordered service and lost the right to hold positions involving corporate finances. The professional organizations that had once promoted her as the future of Whitaker heritage quietly removed her biography from their websites. Former friends stopped inviting her to events. Brand partners terminated their agreements. Graham never contacted her again. There was no private reconciliation, no final meeting, and no message explaining what she had lost. He ended the relationship with the same decision he had made at Stonebridge Manor. He stepped away from a person who treated trust as a resource to be managed. Several months after the sentencing, Elise sent me another letter. The envelope arrived on a Thursday afternoon and rested on my kitchen counter for 3 days. I went to work on Friday. I met Naomi for dinner that evening. On Saturday morning, I reviewed reports for a new client and took a long walk through the neighborhood near my apartment. The envelope stayed exactly where I had placed it. It did not control the room. It did not change my breathing. It did not turn me back into the older sister who believed every family crisis was hers to solve. Years earlier, any message from Elise would have demanded an immediate answer. Need examined every sentence, searched for hidden danger, and tried to determine what she needed from me. This time, I allowed the letter to wait. When I finally opened it, Elise did not ask me to change my testimony. She did not ask for money, forgiveness, or help restoring her career. She wrote that she had spent years telling herself I was stronger, so hurting me cost less. She admitted that our parents had taught her to measure survival by asking who else could be made to carry the damage. Whenever she felt trapped, she looked for someone more capable, more independent, or less protected than she was. Then she convinced herself that person would recover. For most of her life, that person had been me. She wrote that Harold and Constance had shaped her fears, rewarded her obedience, and taught her how to hide behind weakness. Then she wrote the sentence that made me stop reading for several seconds. They influenced my choices, but they did not make those choices for me. For the first time, Elise separated explanation from innocence. I believed that sentence. I still did not answer. Accountability was not a doorway back into my life. An honest explanation could matter without earning immediate forgiveness. Remorse did not erase planning. Self-awareness did not restore trust. Elise needed to become a different person without using reconciliation with me as proof that she had changed. If I answered too soon, she might turn my response into another form of protection. If Mara forgave her, she could tell herself, then perhaps the damage had not been permanent. But the damage was permanent. That did not mean my life was ruined. It meant the relationship could not return to what it had been before. Some consequences were not punishments. They were boundaries that arrived after trust had been exhausted. My own life became quieter again. I continued my compliance work and accepted cases on terms I chose. I no longer mistook exhaustion for commitment. I stopped treating every difficult assignment as a test of whether I deserved the career I had rebuilt. Journalists contacted me after the sentencing. Some wanted to discuss corporate fraud. Others wanted the dramatic version. The bald sister walking into the wedding, the groom leaving, the bride exposed, and the parents turning against each other in front of their guests. I declined every interview. I also declined invitations from professional organizations that wanted to present me as the daughter who defeated her family. I had spent too many years being used as a character in Constance's public story. I would not build a new identity around being their victim. My hair grew back slowly. At first, every new inch felt like evidence that time was moving forward. I measured it in the mirror and noticed the changing texture beneath my fingertips. The scratches healed. The uneven patches filled in. The bare skin that had once drawn every camera gradually disappeared beneath short, dark strands. Eventually, I stopped measuring. I kept my hair short because I liked the style. It was practical, clean, and entirely mine. It did not represent survival, revenge, courage, or defiance unless I decided it did. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the window of my office. For several seconds, I did not think about the clippers, the ballroom, or the cameras. I did not see the woman in the urgent care clinic or the daughter standing between 3 people begging her to rewrite the truth. I saw a woman in a room she had chosen, doing work she respected, with a name that belonged completely to her. That was the part my family never understood. Freedom was not receiving their apology. It was reaching the point where their apology could no longer determine the quality of my life. They had spent years teaching me that love required silence, that strength meant absorbing damage, and that family loyalty meant helping dishonest people escape the consequences of their actions. I no longer believed any of it. I had preserved the evidence when it mattered. I had told the truth when silence would have been easier. I had refused to trade one person's guilt for another person's protection. And once the investigation was finished, I allowed myself to put the evidence away. The rest of my life did not need to remain organized around what they had done. When you spend years carrying the heavy burden of someone else's lies, you eventually realize that staying silent does not protect the peace. It only maintains a cage built by people who never cared about your freedom. The hardest lesson of walking away from a toxic family is learning that true survival does not come from waiting for an apology that will never arrive, but from refusing to hold up the walls of a corrupt structure that was designed to crush you. You do not owe your life, your career, or your sanity to a legacy built on manipulation, and choosing to drop that weight is the ultimate act of reclaiming your own name. How many times have you found yourself apologizing for a storm you did not create, just to keep the peace with people who handed you the lightning?